My name is Freya Serena. I'm 36 years old, and until recently, I believed I had built a life that was steady, thoughtful, and safe. I'm a healthcare compliance consultant in Seattle, someone who reads contracts carefully, who notices footnotes, who believes that details matter. Most people describe me as calm, reliable, reasonable. What they often mean is quiet. I've been underestimated for most of my life. Not because I lacked intelligence or ambition, but because I don't announce myself. I don't interrupt. I don't raise my voice to win an argument. I prefer observation over reaction, and when you're a woman who doesn't perform emotion loudly, people sometimes assume you don't feel things deeply. They're wrong. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about dramatic courtroom victories or explosive confrontations. It's about something quieter, something slower. It's about what happens when someone believes your stillness means surrender. A few months ago, while I was sedated in a hospital room recovering from a minor procedure, my husband tried to make me sign divorce papers. He thought I wouldn't remember. He thought I wouldn't understand. But I did something he never expected. I recorded the conversation, and the audio revealed a side of him even I hadn't seen. What you're about to hear isn't a tale of shouting matches or shattered glass. It's a study in subtle erosion, how respect disappears in small, almost invisible moments. How can someone slowly assign you a role you never agreed to play? How silence, when chosen consciously, becomes something far more powerful than anger. I'll tell you who I was in that marriage. I'll tell you the small cuts I ignored, the ways I rationalized behavior that didn't sit right with me, the day something shifted, not in him, but in me. This is a story about documentation instead of confrontation, about patience instead of panic, about understanding that power doesn't always look loud. And most of all, it's about what it means to reclaim your voice without ever raising it. If you've ever been mistaken for weak simply because you were composed, if you've ever felt yourself being slowly minimized in a room where you once felt equal, then maybe you'll understand why I chose the path I did. Tell me, have you ever been underestimated because you refused to perform strength the way others expected? Before the hospital room, before the recording, before I understood how carefully someone could underestimate me, I was the stable one. That's how Daniel used to introduce me at dinner parties. Stable, practical, good with details. He would say it with a smile, his hand resting lightly at the small of my back as if he were presenting a well-trained thoroughbred. People would nod approvingly. They'd turn to him for the more animated stories, his startup ideas, his ambitious projections, his charming exaggerations. I was the punctuation to his exclamation points. To his friends, I was the reasonable wife, the one who handled logistics, the one who remembered birthdays and insurance renewals, the one who could be counted on to smooth over social tension when Daniel said something just slightly too bold. To his family, I was polite, gracious, a little quiet. Freya's solo maintenance, his mother once said at Thanksgiving, smiling as if she were complimenting a well-behaved child. I smiled back. Low maintenance. It sounds harmless, sounds kind, but what it often means is she doesn't make waves. In our marriage, I became the infrastructure. I handled our investments, our taxes, and our medical forms. When Daniel wanted to refinance the condo, I reviewed the documents. When he signed contracts for his business partnerships, I skimmed them just in case. He liked to joke that I was his unofficial legal department. He meant it playfully. I took it seriously. I don't think he ever noticed that I remembered everything. Not just numbers and clauses, but tone shifts, word choices, the subtle recalibration of affection over time. In the early years, Daniel asked for my opinion. Later, he informed me of his decisions. Still later, he framed them as if they had always been mutual. I adapted quietly. I told myself this was what maturity looked like. Compromise. Flexibility. Marriage is a long conversation where not every sentence needs to be challenged. When friends asked how we were doing, I said, "We're good." And I believed it, mostly. There was no shouting, no dramatic betrayals, no obvious fractures. Just a slow repositioning. At gatherings, if I started to explain something about healthcare regulations, about market trends, Daniel would gently interrupt. Freya's being modest, he'd say, or she's the cautious one. The room would laugh softly. I would too, because it didn't feel worth correcting. I convinced myself that being underestimated was strategic, that there was safety in it, that not being seen as a threat allowed me to observe more clearly. And in truth, I did see more clearly. I saw how often my labor went unnamed, how frequently my silence was interpreted as agreement, how comfortably Daniel occupied the spotlight while I managed the scaffolding. But I didn't resent him. Not then. I believed I was choosing this role. The grounded partner, the stabilizer, the woman who doesn't need applause because she knows her value internally. What I didn't realize was that over time, the role stopped being a choice. It became an expectation, and expectations, when left unexamined, quietly harden into assumptions. By the time I found myself in that hospital bed, IV in my arm, ceiling tiles blurring softly above me, Daniel didn't see a woman who read every contract twice. He saw someone sedated, someone pliable, someone who wouldn't notice. And that misunderstanding was not an accident. It was the result of years of watching me choose composure over confrontation. He thought that meant I wouldn't act. He was wrong. If you try to pinpoint the exact moment a marriage shifts, you'll probably fail. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with a dramatic soundtrack. It arrives quietly. For me, the first small cut happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Nothing monumental, no raised voices, no slammed doors. Daniel had just come home from a networking event. He was energized, still carrying that buoyant tone he used when he felt admired. I was at the kitchen island reviewing a compliance report for a hospital client. He poured himself a drink and started telling me about a potential investor. I listened. I always listened. When he finished, I asked a simple question about equity distribution and control rights. Nothing confrontational, just practical. He laughed. Not cruelly, not loudly, just a small dismissive chuckle. Freya, you worry too much. That's why I don't loop you in early. You talk me out of everything. He said it affectionately, as if I were a cautious child afraid of roller coasters. I remember the way the kitchen light reflected off the marble countertop. I remember the exact rhythm of the ice cubes clinking in his glass. I remember because something inside me paused. I wasn't trying to talk him out of anything. I was trying to protect him. But in that moment, I saw something subtle. My caution, once valued, had been reframed as a limitation. My input, once requested, was now preemptively disqualified. I smiled. I said, I'm just asking questions. He kissed my forehead. And that's why you're good at what you do. Leave the risk to me. Leave the risk to me. It sounds romantic, almost protective. But embedded in it was a quiet repositioning. Your role is containment, not direction. The next week, I found out he had already signed a preliminary agreement with that investor on terms that significantly reduced his long-term control. When I gently pointed out the clause, he waved it off. It's standard. You're overanalyzing. Maybe I was. That's what I told myself. At dinner with friends later that month, someone asked how Daniel balanced ambition with stability. He gestured toward me and said, I married my risk management department. Everyone laughed. I did too. But something about the phrasing lingered. I wasn't his partner in that moment. I was a function, a department, a utility. And the strange part, no one else noticed. Not our friends, not his colleagues, not even me, fully. Because it wasn't cruel. It wasn't explosive. It was a subtle reframing. The kind that happens gradually enough that you question your own reaction. Was I being sensitive? Was I misreading tone? Was this just playful banter? That's the dangerous part about the first small cut. It's easy to dismiss. It doesn't bleed loudly, but it changes the shape of things. From that night forward, I noticed a pattern. Not overt disrespect, just a steady narrowing of where my voice was welcome. Financial logistics, yes. Emotional input, sometimes. Strategic direction, not really. And because I loved him, because I believed in us, I told myself it was temporary, a phase, stress. What I didn't understand then was this. The first time someone redefines your value in a smaller way, and you let it pass, you teach them the size they're allowed to see you. And I had just handed him a smaller version of me. The thing about subtle dismissal is that it doesn't feel like disrespect at first. It feels like personality differences. Daniel was bold. I was cautious. Daniel moved quickly. I preferred to verify. It was easy to frame our dynamic as a balance rather than an imbalance. So, when the interruptions became more frequent, I told myself he was just excited. When he finalized decisions without telling me, I told myself he didn't want to burden me. When he described our shared choices as his independent initiatives, I told myself it wasn't worth correcting in public. I became very skilled at reinterpretation. One night, we were out with another couple of friends from his startup circle. The conversation turned to property investments. Daniel started describing how he had structured our portfolio to minimize tax exposure. I remember staring at the candle between us, watching the flame flicker as he spoke. I had built that structure. I had spent weeks comparing municipal bonds, calculating risk ratios, and mapping long-term projections. But when he said I decided, I didn't interrupt. I smiled. I sipped my water. After dinner in the car, I said lightly, "You know I handled most of that portfolio, right?" He shrugged. "We're married, Freya. It's the same thing." It wasn't, but I let it be. That became our pattern. I would notice something, an erasure, a simplification, a subtle repositioning of credit, and I would weigh whether it was worth the emotional friction of pointing it out. Most of the time, it didn't seem like it was. There were no explosive arguments, just small recalibrations. At family gatherings, if someone asked about my work, Daniel would answer for me. "She's in compliance," he'd say vaguely, then redirect the conversation to one of his projects. I told myself I didn't need the spotlight. I told myself being seen wasn't the same as being valued. But over time, a strange thing began to happen. When people consistently see you as quiet, they begin speaking around you. Not maliciously, just habitually. They stop checking for your reaction. They assume your agreement. And if you don't interrupt that assumption, it solidifies. There were moments when I almost corrected him publicly, when I almost said, "Actually, that was my decision." But I would imagine the tension it might create, the way the room would shift, the subtle embarrassment. So I chose composure. What I didn't realize was that every uncorrected misrepresentation then wasn't just about him. It was about me reinforcing the role I was slipping into. Reliable, useful, peripheral. And the most disorienting part? Daniel wasn't cruel. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't overtly demeaning. If I had described our marriage to someone, it would have sounded stable, respectable, even supportive. That's how normalization works. It disguises erosion as compatibility. There was one particular moment that still echoes in my memory. We were discussing a potential move to a larger house. I expressed hesitation about the timing, interest rates, market volatility, and his company's cash flow. He exhaled slowly, the way someone does when they're trying to be patient. "Freya," he said gently, "not everything has to be analyzed to death. Sometimes you just have to trust me." Trust me, as if my analysis was distrusted, as if prudence were opposition. I nodded. I said, "Okay." And in that "okay," something subtle shifted again. Because the more I absorbed these small redefinitions without resistance, the more natural they became, to him and eventually to me. By the time I found myself in that hospital bed months later, the groundwork had already been laid. Not with cruelty, with repetition. There's a moment in every long relationship when you realize you're no longer improvising. You're performing. Not dramatically, not consciously, but predictably. By our 8th year of marriage, Daniel and I had settled into what looked, from the outside, like efficiency. He handled expansion. I handled protection. He generated ideas. I assessed risk. On paper, it was balanced. In practice, it was hierarchical. Somewhere along the way, my caution stopped being an equal counterweight and started being treated as a ceiling. Daniel became the visionary. I became the brake pedal. And brakes, by definition, are meant to slow things down. I began noticing how often my contributions were framed as containment rather than creation. When his company faced a minor regulatory issue, I drafted the response plan. When a contract dispute surfaced, I identified the clause that protected him. Afterward, he would say, "Good thing you're detail-oriented." Never, "Good thing you're strategic." The distinction matters. Detail-oriented suggests maintenance. Strategic suggests leadership. At social events, I watched how conversations flowed. Daniel stood slightly ahead of me, shoulders open, voice animated. I stood beside him, smiling, nodding, filling in small clarifications when necessary. People would look at him when asking about the future. They'd look at me when asking about logistics. Without ever explicitly discussing it, we had assigned each other roles, but only one of us benefited from the narrative those roles created. One evening, his mother said something that settled into me like fine dust. We were clearing dishes after dinner, and she leaned close, her voice warm but measured. "Daniel's always needed someone steady," she said. "He can be impulsive. It's good you don't challenge him too much." Don't challenge him too much. The assumption wasn't that I couldn't challenge him. It was that I shouldn't. That harmony required my restraint. That strength, in my case, meant quiet support. I smiled politely. I dried the plates. But later that night, lying in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling and asked myself something uncomfortable. When did I agree to be the stabilizer instead of the equal? The answer was simple. I never explicitly agreed. I just didn't object as the narrative formed. Daniel began making larger financial decisions without consulting me fully. He would inform me afterward, sometimes with enthusiasm, sometimes casually. I would review the paperwork anyway. I would protect us quietly. And each time I did, I reinforced the idea that my role was correction, not direction. Reliable, useful, invisible. That was the role. The dependable wife who absorbs risk silently. The calm presence who doesn't demand recognition. The one who keeps the ship steady but never claims to steer it. The unsettling part wasn't that Daniel imposed this role with cruelty. It was that it formed naturally in the absence of resistance. And because I had always valued composure over confrontation, I became exceptionally good at inhabiting it. By the time the hospital room came into the picture, Daniel didn't see a woman capable of strategic action. He saw the steady wife, the one who would keep things quiet, the one who wouldn't make waves, and that assumption was about to become very expensive for him. The shift didn't happen in the hospital. It happened weeks before, on a quiet Sunday morning, when there was nothing dramatic in the air. No arguments, no tension sharp enough to name. Just the soft hum of the espresso machine and rain tracing slow lines down our living room windows. Daniel was pacing, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in the confident cadence he used when negotiating. I wasn't listening intentionally. I was reviewing quarterly reports at the dining table. But then I heard my name. "Yeah, she'll sign it," he said. "She doesn't like conflict." There was a pause. He laughed lightly. "No, she trusts me." I didn't look up. I didn't make a sound. I simply let the words land. "She'll sign it." I didn't know what it was. A contract, a restructuring document, something business related. But the certainty in his voice, that calm assumption of compliance, felt different. Not cruel, predictive. And that was the moment something inside me shifted. It wasn't anger. It wasn't betrayal in the cinematic sense. It was clarity. I realized that Daniel's perception of me had crystallized. In his mind, I was no longer a partner whose consent required engagement. I was a formality, a signature, a stabilizing accessory to decisions already made. And I had helped build that perception. The awareness didn't sting immediately. Instead, it created distance. A small, almost imperceptible widening between who I knew myself to be and who he believed I was. That afternoon, I did something subtle. I opened my leather notebook, the one I carry everywhere, and wrote down the date. I summarized the phone call from memory, the phrasing, the tone, not because I planned to use it, because I needed to see it outside of my own head. When you document something, it becomes real in a different way. It stops being a feeling and becomes a fact. Over the next few weeks, I paid closer attention. I didn't confront him. I didn't accuse him. I simply observed. When he mentioned meetings vaguely, I asked for specifics. When he referenced documents, I requested copies. My tone stayed light, curious, non-threatening. He complied, mostly, but I noticed hesitation creeping in, a slight narrowing of information. Summaries instead of details. The shift inside me wasn't reactive. It was strategic. I stopped assuming we were aligned. I started verifying. And for the first time in our marriage, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had quietly avoided. What if my silence wasn't preserving harmony? What if it were financing my own erasure? The thought didn't come with panic. It came with calm. I began reviewing our shared accounts more carefully. I revisited documents I had skimmed months earlier. I updated my own financial files independently, making copies of everything. Not secretly, just systematically. Daniel didn't notice. Why would he? I had always handled paperwork. But internally, something irreversible had begun. I no longer interpreted his dismissals as personality differences. I saw them as data points. And once you start collecting data, you stop arguing emotionally. You wait. You observe. You prepare. I didn't know yet that a hospital stay was coming. I didn't know about the divorce papers. But I knew this. If he believed I would sign anything simply because he asked at the right moment, then he didn't understand me at all. There's a difference between silence born from fear and silence chosen with intention. For years, mine had been the first kind. Gentle, accommodating, designed to keep things smooth. After that Sunday morning phone call, it became the second. I stopped correcting Daniel casually, not because I agreed, but because I wanted to see how far the assumptions extended. I wanted clarity, not conflict. Clarity requires stillness. At dinner one evening, he mentioned restructuring some assets for tax efficiency. In the past, I would have asked immediate follow-up questions. This time, I nodded and let him finish. He didn't elaborate. That told me more than any explanation would have. When someone believes you won't challenge them, they relax. They stop curating their language. They reveal patterns without realizing it. I began noticing how often decisions were already in motion before I heard about them. New meetings, new advisors, documents referenced but not shown. Still, I didn't react. My quietness unsettled him slightly, I think. Not overtly, but there were moments when he would search my face, as if expecting resistance that didn't come. "You're quiet lately," he said one night, half teasing. "Just thinking," I replied. That was true. I was thinking about structure, about contingency, about what protection looks like when the person you're protecting yourself from doesn't think you're capable of defense. Silence, when chosen strategically, does something powerful. It shifts the dynamic of information. The other person begins filling the space you've left open, and Daniel did. He started talking more freely about long-term plans, expansion, relocation, simplifying things. That phrase appeared often. Simplifying. It sounded efficient, clean, but simplicity in financial language can sometimes mean separation. One afternoon, while reviewing shared documents, I noticed a consultation invoice from a family law firm. It was subtle, categorized under advisory services. My pulse didn't spike. Instead, it slowed. This is what preparation feels like. Not hysteria, not disbelief, just the quiet click of pieces aligning. I didn't confront him. I didn't search his phone. I didn't accuse. I made copies of the financial statements. I downloaded transaction histories. I ensured that my own accounts were fully independent and accessible. Everything legal, everything methodical. And I scheduled my own consultation with a different attorney. Not because I wanted war, because I wanted information. Knowledge removes panic. The attorney didn't tell me to escalate. She didn't suggest dramatic action. She simply explained options. Rights, protections, timing. Timing. That word stayed with me. I returned home that evening and watched Daniel across the dinner table. He looked relaxed, confident, certain. Certain of what? That I wouldn't question him. That I wouldn't resist, that if he ever presented something formal, I would prioritize harmony over scrutiny. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't volatile. He was comfortable, and comfort can be the most dangerous underestimation of all. By then, my silence was no longer acceptable. It was reconnaissance. I wasn't waiting for confrontation. I was waiting for confirmation, and it was coming. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That was my advantage. Daniel never questioned why I spent evenings reviewing spreadsheets. I had always done that. He didn't ask why I reorganized our digital files. I had always been methodical. He didn't think twice when I requested updated copies of insurance policies or tax summaries. I was simply being detail-oriented, but this time the intention was different. I wasn't reviewing to support his plans. I was mapping the terrain in case I needed to walk away from them. I created a timeline in my leather notebook. Dates, transfers, new business registrations, consultations. Every subtle shift I had observed over the past year, I cross-referenced them with our financial movements. Patterns emerged. Small asset reallocations, new accounts I hadn't been directly looped into. Advisory fees are categorized vaguely. Nothing illegal, nothing explosive, just strategic positioning. The realization didn't break me. It steadied me. Because once you see the architecture of someone's intention, you stop personalizing it. You stop asking, why would he do this to me? And start asking, what is he preparing for? That shift is liberating. At the same time, I strengthened my own position quietly. I ensured my professional credentials were fully updated and accessible. I reconnected with two former colleagues over coffee, casually, warmly. I increased the liquidity in my personal account, legally transferring funds that were already allocated to me. I didn't hide what I was doing, I just didn't narrate it. Silence again became space. Daniel began speaking more confidently about streamlining our future. He talked about freedom from complications. He framed it as growth, as evolution. And I listened. One evening, he mentioned that he had been thinking about restructuring our personal agreements to match where we are now. Personal agreements. The language was corporate, detached. I tilted my head slightly. What do you mean? Just aligning things legally, he said smoothly. It's responsible. Responsible. There it was again. The reframing of unilateral movement as prudence. I nodded. Of course, just send me whatever documents you're referencing. I'll review them. He hesitated, barely. It's preliminary, nothing formal yet. That hesitation confirmed everything. He believed I would sign first and read later if the circumstances were convenient enough. That's when I made a decision that would later matter more than I understood at the time. I tested something small, A week before my scheduled medical procedure, a minor surgery that required sedation, I mentioned casually that I preferred to review all paperwork personally before signing anything, even hospital forms. He smiled. You and your paperwork. Yes, I said gently, always. I watched his expression carefully. It flickered for a fraction of a second. Not anger, not fear, just recalculation. That was when I knew timing was part of his strategy. The procedure had been on the calendar for months. It wasn't urgent, just necessary. He had offered to handle any documents while I recovered. At the time, it had sounded supportive. Now it sounded convenient. The night before the surgery, I charged my phone fully. I adjusted one setting I rarely used, voice memo auto record. Not because I expected drama, but clarity requires evidence, not memory alone. I told myself I might never need it. Preparation doesn't mean paranoia. It means respect for possibility. In the hospital room the next day, as the anesthesia began to blur the edges of the ceiling lights, I felt calm. Not naive, not frightened. Calm, because if he chose that moment, if he mistook sedation for surrender, I would not be relying on recollection. I would have a record. What he never noticed was that while he had been quietly repositioning assets, I had been quietly repositioning awareness. And awareness, unlike money, cannot be reallocated once it exists. The hospital room was too bright. That's the first thing I remember clearly. The ceiling tiles were an off-white that felt almost luminous under the fluorescent lights. There was a faint antiseptic smell, steady and clinical. My arm felt heavy. My thoughts moved as if through water. Sedation is strange. You're not fully unconscious. You're suspended. Voices drift in and out like distant radio frequencies. I remember the nurse adjusting the IV. I remember Daniel's hand resting over mine. Warm, reassuring, familiar. Then I remember the paper, the soft shuffle of documents being placed on the small hospital tray table, the faint scratch of a pen being uncapped. Freya, Daniel's voice said gently, leaning close. I just need your signature on something routine. It's administrative, nothing complicated. Administrative. Even through the haze, that word registered. I didn't open my eyes fully. I let them remain heavy, unfocused. My body felt compliant, pliable, exactly as he must have anticipated. I already reviewed it, he continued softly. It's just aligning things legally. It's better this way. Better this way. There's something about hearing strategic language, when your body is compromised, that sharpens the mind in unexpected ways. The anesthesia dulled my muscles, but not my pattern recognition. I let my breathing stay slow, even. He shifted closer. The paper rustled again. It simplifies everything, he said. You trust me, right? There it was. Trust as leverage. My fingers twitched slightly, not from emotion, but from effort. Effort to remain still, to listen, to absorb without reacting. I heard another voice on speakerphone. Faint, professional, male. She just needs to initial page 3 and sign at the bottom, the voice said. Calm, efficient. Page 3. My phone was in the side pocket of my hospital bag, auto-recording. A small red dot I had activated the night before. Daniel lowered his voice further. She's sedated but responsive. It'll be fine. Sedated but responsive. That sentence split something open inside me. Not because it was shouted, not because it was cruel, because it was calculated. I felt the pen being pressed lightly into my fingers. My hand didn't close around it. Not fully. Freya, he coaxed gently. Just a quick signature. In that moment, clarity arrived. Not emotionally, but structurally. This wasn't an impulsive act. This was timing. This was an assessment. This was someone who had measured my tendency toward harmony and chosen a window where resistance would be minimal. I let my head shift slightly, as if struggling. I murmured something unintelligible. My hand slipped. The pen fell against the sheet instead of forming letters. Maybe she's too groggy, the voice on the phone said. Daniel exhaled softly. Not angry, just inconvenienced. Okay, he replied. We'll revisit. The tray table moved. The documents were gathered. The pen was capped again. I remained still, breathing evenly, listening to the quiet recalculation in the room. He thought I wouldn't remember clearly. That sedation would blur the edges enough to create plausible deniability for both of us. He was wrong about one critical detail. Memory is unreliable. Audio is not. When I woke fully hours later, the room was quieter. The documents were gone. Daniel was seated beside the bed, scrolling on his phone. He looked up and smiled warmly. How are you feeling? He asked. Tired, I said honestly. I didn't confront him. Not then, not even the next day. Because the reveal wasn't for him. It was for me. That evening, when I was alone at home resting, I played the recording. I listened without interruption, without tears, without a raised heartbeat. And I heard something I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge before. Not villainy, entitlement. Certainty that my consent was procedural, not meaningful. That my body in that moment was simply a vehicle for execution. The divorce papers, because that's what they were, carefully labeled as marital dissolution agreement, had been prepared in advance, structured cleanly, efficiently. He hadn't planned a confrontation. He had planned convenience. The audio didn't devastate me. It clarified me. Because once you hear someone speak about you as an obstacle to be navigated rather than a partner to be engaged, something fundamental realigns inside you. There was no rage, no dramatic collapse, only certainty. He had shown me who he believed I was. Now I would show him who I actually was. There's a moment after clarity where everything feels strangely still. No chaos, no shouting, just a quiet intersection where multiple paths exist, and only one of them preserves your self-respect. The morning after I listened to the recording in full, I made coffee as usual. Daniel kissed my cheek before leaving for a meeting. His tone was unchanged. His routine is intact. If I hadn't heard the audio, I might have questioned my own interpretation. But sound has a way of removing ambiguity. I sat at the dining table with my notebook open and listed my options. Not emotionally, strategically. Option 1. Confront him immediately. Play the recording. Demand explanation. Watch him justify timing, intention, miscommunication. That path would give me temporary catharsis. It would also alert him. He would recalibrate faster than I could. Option 2. Pretend nothing happened. Sign later under different circumstances. Preserve the image of harmony. That path would preserve comfort, but it would cost me something deeper. Option 3. Move first. Not impulsively, not vindictively, but decisively. The difference between reacting and acting is timing. Reaction is driven by emotion. Action is driven by preparation. He had prepared for a convenient signature. I had prepared for something else entirely. I scheduled a second meeting with my attorney. I brought the audio file. I didn't dramatize it. I simply asked, "What are my options if I want to ensure fairness?" She listened carefully. Her expression remained neutral. "He attempted to obtain a signature while you were sedated?" She clarified. "Yes, that complicates things for him," she said evenly. Complicates. I didn't want to destroy him. I didn't want humiliation. I wanted balance restored. We reviewed financial disclosures, asset division structures, skimming, filing procedures. Here's what most people misunderstand about power. It doesn't require spectacle. It requires leverage applied at the right moment. By the time Daniel intended to present those divorce papers again, this time in a more appropriate setting, I would already have filed independently, with full documentation, with a clear asset inventory, with legal protections in place. Irreversible. That was the word that mattered. Once filed properly, certain movements cannot be undone quietly. Accounts freeze. Transactions become transparent. Disclosures become mandatory. And transparency was the one thing he hadn't anticipated. The night before I signed my own filing documents, I sat alone in the living room. The rain returned, soft against the windows. I thought about our early years, the laughter, the ambition, the version of us that once felt aligned. I didn't feel hatred. I felt resolved. Because the decision wasn't about punishing him for attempting to make me sign while sedated. It was about what that attempt revealed. He believed my consent was procedural, and I could no longer participate in a dynamic where my presence was administrative. The next morning, I signed. Not under anesthesia, not under suggestion. Fully alert, fully aware, and I filed first. He wouldn't know yet, but the direction of the story had just changed permanently. Filing paperwork doesn't feel dramatic. There's no soundtrack, no thunder, just ink drying on a page and a timestamp in a clerk system. When my attorney submitted the documents, she called me with the same tone she used for everything. Measured, professional. "It's done," she said. Done. That word didn't feel explosive. It felt structural, like a beam being set in place. Daniel had no idea. That evening, he came home talking about a potential expansion opportunity in another state. His energy was buoyant. He described future plans as if the ground beneath us were unchanged. I listened. I asked small neutral questions. Timing is everything in legal matters. There's a brief window between filing and formal service where nothing appears different. Thus, accounts function. Conversations continue. Dinner is cooked. But beneath that calm surface, systems begin to shift. Asset disclosures become mandatory. Financial movements become traceable. Any attempt to transfer significant funds triggers scrutiny. And Daniel, confident in his own timeline, continued operating as if he controlled it. A few days later, he mentioned meeting with advisors again. He spoke casually about simplifying joint holdings. I nodded. That sounds productive. It was strange how easy composure became once I no longer felt uncertain. I wasn't suppressing emotion. I was anchored by information. Meanwhile, I made additional quiet adjustments. I redirected my mail to a private P.O. box. I ensured my credit accounts were fully independent. I documented household assets thoroughly: furniture, artwork, investments. Not because I expected hostility, but because clarity protects both sides. I also transferred a fair, legally advised portion of liquid funds into an account solely in my name. Funds I was entitled to, transparent, documented. If he later questioned it, I would have a simple answer: preparation. The most powerful part of moving in silence is that it denies the other person emotional leverage. There were no arguments for him to frame me as irrational, no outbursts to point at, no accusations. Just paper, dates, signatures. One afternoon, while he was in his office taking a call, I walked past and heard a fragment of a conversation. "I'll handle it soon," he said confidently. "She won't make this complicated." I paused for half a second in the hallway. He still believed that narrative he had constructed. And I realized something then. People don't adjust their assumptions until reality forces them to. The official service of divorce papers is not theatrical, it's procedural. A courier, a signature, documentation. I chose not to be present when it happened. I scheduled a work meeting across town. I didn't want to witness surprise. I didn't need to. My phone buzzed mid-afternoon. A message from him. "What is this?" 3 words, not anger, not an accusation. Confusion. For the first time in years, the timing was not his. The structure was not his. The narrative was not his. And I was still calm. Because I hadn't acted in rage. I had acted in sequence. He had tried to secure my signature while I was sedated. Instead, he received mine, filed first, deliberate, irreversible. Quiet dominance doesn't announce itself. It simply rearranges the outcome. When control shifts, it rarely announces itself with shouting. It shows up as a disruption. Daniel called 3 times before I returned his message. Not because I was avoiding him, but because I wanted my tone to be steady when we spoke. When I finally answered, his voice was tight but contained. "Why would you file without talking to me?" he asked. It wasn't outrage. It was disbelief. I sat at my desk, looking out at the gray Seattle sky. "We've been talking," I said evenly, "just not directly." A pause. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means I reviewed everything carefully," I replied, "and I made a decision." Silence stretched between us. I could almost hear the recalibration happening in his mind. "You didn't have to make this complicated," he said finally. There it was again. Complicated. As if fairness were an inconvenience. "I'm not making it complicated," I said. "I'm making it transparent." That word landed heavier than I expected. Transparency changes dynamics instantly. Within 48 hours of being served, his tone shifted from confusion to urgency. He scheduled emergency meetings with his advisors. He began reviewing accounts more aggressively. He asked for copies of documents he assumed he already controlled. And for the first time, he realized that certain financial movements were now frozen pending disclosure. It wasn't punishment, it was a procedure. But to someone accustomed to moving first and explaining later, procedure feels like resistance. At home, the atmosphere changed subtly. Not hostile, just unsettled. He watched me more closely, measured my expressions. "You could have just told me you were unhappy," he said one evening, standing in the kitchen doorway. I turned from the sink, drying my hands slowly. "This isn't about unhappiness," I said. "It's about consent." He frowned. "Consent? You tried to get me to sign something while I was sedated." The words were calm, not accusatory, just factual. His face shifted, surprise first, then defensiveness. "That wasn't what you thought it was. You were responsive." "I have the recording," I said gently. The room stilled, not because I raised my voice, because I didn't. The certainty in my tone left no space for dismissal. He didn't explode, he didn't shout, he recalculated. "I was trying to handle things efficiently," he said after a moment. "I know," I replied. That acknowledgement disarmed him more than an accusation would have. The consequences weren't dramatic, they were structural. He had to disclose assets he intended to reposition quietly. He had to explain advisory consultations he categorized vaguely. He had to operate within timelines he no longer controlled. For the first time, he wasn't moving ahead of me. We were on equal procedural ground, and that equality felt unfamiliar to him. Friends began sensing something was different, though we didn't announce anything publicly. There was less ease at gatherings, less performative unity. Daniel, once so confident in narrative, seemed cautious now. Not because I threatened him, because I removed ambiguity. When someone loses the ability to rely on your silence, they feel the absence of it. Even if you remain composed, the consequences had begun. Not loudly, but irrevocably. Panic doesn't always look frantic. Sometimes it looks like sudden tenderness. About a week after the filing, Daniel began adjusting his tone. Softer greetings, longer eye contact, offers to talk things through. Maybe we rushed into this, he said one evening, sitting across from me at the dining table, the same table where I had once reviewed compliance reports while he negotiated on the phone. I folded my hands calmly. I didn't rush. He inhaled slowly, recalibrating again. We can restructure differently. If it's about financial protection, we can adjust the terms. There it was. He still thought this was about clauses, percentages, structuring. I'm not negotiating under anesthesia, I said gently. The sentence wasn't sharp. It didn't need to be. His jaw tightened just slightly. You keep framing it that way. How would you frame it? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Because there isn't a softer synonym for attempting to secure a signature from someone whose capacity is compromised. There are explanations, there are justifications, but there isn't a reframing that removes intent. Over the next few days, his urgency increased, not explosively, but strategically. He suggested mediation to simplify things. He proposed revised settlements that were marginally more favorable to me. He implied that public proceedings could hurt both of us. What he was really saying was, regain alignment quietly, but alignment requires trust. And trust had shifted from assumption to evidence. One afternoon, he stood by the window while I was reviewing emails. The rain was steady, tapping against the glass. I didn't think you'd go this far, he said quietly. I looked up at him. I didn't think you would either. That was the closest we came to something resembling emotional honesty. Because beneath the paperwork, beneath the disclosures and filings, there was a simpler truth. He had miscalculated me. Not maliciously, not monstrously, confidently. He believed my composure meant compliance. He believed my silence meant passivity. He believed timing could override consent. And when that belief failed, he experienced something he hadn't prepared for: loss of narrative control. The legal process moved forward steadily. Asset disclosures were completed. Timelines were locked in. Certain decisions, once filed, cannot be undone without mutual agreement. He requested a private conversation one final time before mediation. If I apologize, he said carefully, does that change anything? I considered the question honestly. An apology acknowledges harm, I said. It doesn't erase it. He nodded slowly. I think in that moment he understood that this wasn't about revenge or financial advantage. It was about precedent. If I had accepted that hospital room attempt without consequence, even privately, it would have validated the assumption behind it. And I could not validate that version of myself. By the time he realized the permanence of the filing, it was structurally too late. The system was in motion, and I was no longer the stabilizer absorbing impact quietly. I was the one who had moved first, calmly, irreversibly. The final conversation didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in our living room. By then, most of the logistics were in motion. Mediation dates scheduled, financial disclosures exchanged. There was no dramatic twist left, only acknowledgement. Daniel stood near the bookshelf, hands loosely clasped. He looked tired but not defeated, just aware. I keep replaying that day in the hospital, he said quietly. It wasn't supposed to look the way you're describing it. I sat on the couch, posture relaxed. Intent doesn't erase impact. He nodded slowly, no argument this time. For years, our disagreements had lived in subtlety. Indirect language, soft reframing. But this conversation felt stripped of performance. I thought I was protecting both of us, he continued, avoiding conflict, making it easier. Easier for who? I asked gently. The question hung there. He didn't answer immediately, and in that silence, something honest surfaced. For me, he admitted. There was no triumph in hearing that, just confirmation. I didn't think you'd challenge it, he added. I know, I said. That was the core of it. Not betrayal in the cinematic sense, not cruelty. Expectation. He had expected my compliance because I had trained him to expect it. Years of composure, of smoothing tension, of absorbing narrative shifts quietly. This wasn't a confrontation filled with raised voices. It was a recalibration of perception. I never saw you as weak, he said almost defensively. I know, I replied. You saw me as steady. And that's not weakness. No, I agreed, but it's not submission either. The distinction seemed to land. We talked for nearly an hour. Not about assets or percentages, but about pattern, about how roles had formed without explicit agreement, about how my silence had gradually been mistaken for surrender. There was no shouting, no tears, just clarity. At one point, he asked, if I hadn't tried that in the hospital, would we still be here? I considered the question carefully. Eventually, I said, because the hospital room wasn't the beginning, it was confirmation. The visible edge of something that had been building for years. He exhaled slowly, absorbing that. I misjudged you, he said finally. Yes, I replied, not bitterly, not proudly, just factually. There's a kind of power in not escalating, in refusing to turn acknowledgement into humiliation. I didn't need him to crumble. I needed him to understand. And understanding doesn't require spectacle. As the conversation ended, he looked at me differently. Not as infrastructure, not as background stability, as an equal. Ironically, it took separation to restore that perception. But by then, the structure had already shifted, and I had no desire to return to a role that required me to shrink for harmony. It's been 8 months since the mediation was finalized. The paperwork is complete. The condo has been sold, accounts divided, lives reorganized. From the outside, it probably looks like a quiet, efficient divorce. No public scandal, no dramatic fallout. Just two adults who grew apart. That's the simplified version. The fuller version is this. I grew into clarity. I still live in Seattle. A smaller place now. Sunlight in the mornings, a desk by the window, fewer square feet but more ownership of the space. There's something grounding about knowing every item in a room is there because you chose it. People sometimes ask if I regret not confronting him sooner, if I wish I had raised my voice more often, corrected him publicly, challenged him in sharper ways. I don't, because this was never about volume. It was about alignment between who I knew myself to be and how I allowed myself to be treated. I used to believe that composure required endurance. That strength meant absorbing friction quietly to preserve stability. Now I understand something different. Composure without boundaries becomes permission. I haven't become louder. I haven't transformed into someone confrontational. My personality didn't shift dramatically. I'm still observant, still analytical, still slow to speak and careful with words. The difference is internal. When someone interrupts me now, I finish my sentence. Not aggressively, just steadily. When a contract crosses my desk, I review it without apology for the time it takes. When someone frames my caution as overthinking, I let them sit with that discomfort. I don't rush to soften myself anymore. Daniel and I don't speak often. When we do, it's civil, structured. There's a strange mutual respect now that didn't fully exist inside the marriage. Not because I hurt him, because I surprised him. And perhaps I surprised myself. The recording still exists. I've never shared it publicly. I never needed to. Its power wasn't in exposure, it was in confirmation. It reminded me that perception and reality can diverge quietly, and that it's my responsibility to correct that divergence when it costs me dignity. What changed most isn't my circumstances, it's my threshold. I no longer tolerate being positioned as procedural, as supportive infrastructure, as a silent reinforcement for someone else's narrative. I'm still calm, but my calm now has edges, and those edges are visible. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Quiet dominance isn't about controlling others. It's about controlling your response. It's about choosing when to speak, when to move, and when to let systems, not emotions, do the work. I didn't burn anything down. I simply refused to sign under sedation. And in doing so, I signed something far more important. My own authority. If you take nothing else from my story, take this. Disrespect rarely begins with shouting. It begins with an assumption. Assumption that you won't object. Assumption that you'll prioritize comfort over clarity. Assumption that your silence means consent. For years, I believed I was preserving peace. I thought composure was enough. I thought that if something truly crossed a line, I would know instantly. But lines blur slowly. They soften at the edges. They get redefined in language that sounds reasonable, efficient, responsible, until one day you realize the decision being made about you never truly included you. He tried to make me sign divorce papers while I was sedated. I recorded the conversation. The audio revealed a side of him even I hadn't seen. Not a monster, not a villain, just a man who believed my steadiness meant surrender. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Part of that belief came from me, from the version of myself that avoided friction at all costs, From the times I let credit slide, let interruptions pass, let reframing go unchallenged because it felt easier in the moment. The hospital room wasn't the beginning, it was the confirmation. Quiet dominance isn't about revenge. It's not about humiliation or spectacle. It's about documentation instead of drama, strategy instead of shouting, boundaries instead of bitterness. It's about understanding that calm does not equal compliant. You can be gentle and immovable at the same time. You can be composed and decisive. You can walk away without burning the house down. If you've ever been underestimated because you didn't perform strength loudly, if someone has mistaken your patience for permission, I want to ask you something. At what point does preserving harmony begin to cost you yourself? Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to prove your strength without raising your voice?